Hey everyone, welcome to the Student Ministry Conversation podcast with your hosts, Russell Martin and Brent Aiken. We are glad that you're joining us today, and we hope that you find this conversation helpful, insightful, and encouraging as you lead your students in ministry. We wanted to stop and take a second to remind you that you can find us on social media at Talk Student Men on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And then you can also check out our website, studentministryconversations.org, where you can find show notes to each episode. You can find blog posts, you can find our merchandise, and other ways to support the podcast. Today, we are going to hear a conversation Russell had with Brandon Hare. Brandon is the pastor at Calvary Christian Church in Bellevue, Nebraska. Today, they are going to sit down to talk about student leadership. Now, some of you might be wondering, haven't they already done a student leadership conversation before? We did back super early in the podcast when I sat down with Daniel Acton, but Russell, obviously this conversation will be different. So what did you guys talk about?
Yeah, I remember that conversation with Daniel as well. But it's important sometimes to hear different perspectives. And so Brandon and I talk about student ministry leadership, why to do it, finding that why, how to do it, what are some specific ways or things to think about, and then finally, what are the benefits and the results of that. And so it's a great conversation, and I look forward to you hearing it as well.
Man, that sounds great. So without further ado, here's Russell's conversation with Brandon Hare.
Well, hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Student Ministry Conversations podcast. I am Russell Martin, and we're glad to bring you a conversation this week with Brandon Hare. And we're going to talk about letting the next generation lead and how do we do that. And so, Brandon, I'm not going to give away all what you're going to talk about. I'm going to let you talk about it. But first, why don't you just let us know kind of who you are? I'm sure there's many people who haven't heard of you before. Who you are, how you got on this, and then how you got to where you are today and what you're doing today.
Awesome. Yeah. So like you said, my name is Brandon Hare. I am the lead student pastor at Calvary Christian Church in Omaha, Nebraska. Got connected with this podcast through a mutual friend of the show, I guess you could say. Melissa was on a earlier episode, an incredible leader on our team here at Calvary, and super stoked to be able to work with her. She told me about the podcast here, and I've been listening to it for a little while and really enjoy it. And so I hope I can bring some value to the conversation. But originally from Charleston, South Carolina, my wife and I moved to Denver, Colorado, about almost 6 years ago at this point, to work with the church plant out there. The goal was to be there for about 2 years and then kind of go on staff with this church. We raised support for a while, and at the end of the 2 years, it wasn't working out. And so I started looking for what was next, and I kind of was doing some deep soul searching, if you will, on what God had next for me. And I came up with two questions to ask. And I said, where's been the joy in ministry, and where have I seen the most fruit in ministry? And the answer to both of those questions was in student ministry. And so I got back into student ministry. Now I've been doing student ministry for about 10 years at this point. It's been another 5 doing other things for a while, trying to figure out who I was. But it all led me back to pouring into 6th through 12th graders. And so here I am, love it. Love everything about it.
Well, awesome. I told you before the show started, I did student ministry for a long time. Kind of just made a little bit of an adjustment or a pivot during COVID, like many people did. But for me too, that is a place of joy and of fruit. And I like those questions. Like we could probably dive down on those some point as far as how discerning ministry and discerning where you're going and where God's calling you. And those are 2 great questions that I wrote down that I will make sure and highlight in the notes. And we'll also make a link to Melissa's episode. I think she talked about worship and creating worship teams and working with those. So we'll make sure and link to that. But awesome. Today we're talking about student ministry leadership. But before we dive in, we have kind of 3 sections we want to kind of touch on that we kind of talked about a little bit before. But before we get to those, why is this important to you?
Yeah, this is a big deal for me. It's probably one of the things that I try to pursue as quickly as possible when a new class comes in, is to try to kind of help them figure out what they're passionate about and what they love doing. And I think that if we step back for a second and look at a lot of student ministry programs, a lot of youth programs, we'll find that like there's kind of a sweet spot for student ministry. And I think that sweet spot is like myself and a friend were talking about this the other day. It's like this 7th through 10th grade sort of sweet spot where students are kind of more engaged than they will be at any point in your ministry. And so at 11th and 12th grade, there's kind of this decline. There's like this, they sort of check out, whether it's, they hit you with all the reasons why, right? Like I've got work, I've got sports, I've got homework, all these things. And those things may be true, and they're often true, but I think on a deeper level, it's also that they've found their place in those things. And so they kind of lean more towards those things. And they where am I? It's the same two questions, right? Like, where's the fruit? Where's the joy? And if they find that they're successful on the football field and they really enjoy playing football, they're going to go lean towards that over coming to church because my mom and dad said so, or because my youth pastor is pressuring me into it. And so I think that there's, we've got to figure out, like, are 11th and 12th graders important to us? And do we need to continue to pour into them and show them Jesus and show them the gospel? And the answer to that question is obviously yes, right? Like, absolutely, we have to do this. We can't just be like, all right, well, you're going to leave anyway, so see ya. And so how do we address that? How do we make youth ministry relevant to 11th and 12th graders? And relevant may not be the best word, but you know what I mean? Like, how do we get them to care? And I think the truth is, the answer to that question is we give them pieces of our ministry so that they can own it, so that when they ask, where's the joy and where's the fruit, they can say, in this relationship and in this community of believers who love and serve Jesus. We see that more and more, like, leaders own their faith, right? Like, they own it for themselves because they're helping spread it, and they're helping other students see Jesus, and they're helping their peers move forward. They own it themselves, and it's not an inherited faith that their parents are pushing on them. It's truly theirs. And when we get them to own their faith, we find that owners, like, invest more. If you think about a house that you rented versus a house that you own, like, you put way more into a home that you own than you do a home that you rent, right? Because at the end of the day, if you smash a hole in the apartment that you're renting, you just call maintenance and they'll come and fix it. You make up some excuse as to what happened and, moves on. But if it's your house, it's on you. And so then you have to put in the sweat and the time to do it. But what happens outside of that? You take better care of it going forward. So I think that it's so important to build a culture of leadership among our students, because it helps them truly own their own faith, and it helps them invest more themselves and get them to look back on their time in student ministry, or look ahead in their time in student ministry and say, this is important. I need to be part of this, and I need to lean into this heavily.
That's something I found when I was looking at those 11th and 12th graders. We utilized a lot of student leadership. That was a big thing in my youth group. And I found, though, that, you would have those kids who, you be the one who leans into football, one who leans into this, but then you have those who lean into student ministry, who lead into, like you said, who take over. We had small group leaders helping lead our small groups, who were, leading junior high small groups, who were 11th and 12th graders, and or running games, or leading worship, or whatever. And so those are all, I almost labeled my 12th graders kind of my legacy members, or I kind of pulled them out a little bit from leadership and made them more like just an advisory team to kind of talk with, because I knew that, once they get into senior year, even your most dedicated kids get crazy schedule.
Yeah.
So when you talk about why is it important, what would you tell somebody who is looking at doing student leadership about that why? Like, how do they maybe find their own why for them? Or is there anything you would help somebody, if someone was, before we get through this conversation, if they're listening, with the first 10 minutes or so, and they're like, okay, why should I keep listening to this? Help them to kind of, maybe, again, you maybe reiterate something you said, but why should they even consider doing this? Why should they listen to the rest of this podcast?
Yeah. Well, because ultimately, at the end of the day, like, what we're here for, what our job is as student pastors, is to help our students, like, go farther than we can take them, right? Like, at the end of 12th grade, when a student graduates, we don't want them to be another statistic of a kid that went to college, got asked a hard question and fell away from the faith because he couldn't answer it. And so, to be honest, like, why should we continue in this journey, and why should we prioritize student leadership? It's because that's where they can wrestle with those hard questions while we can still help them navigate those and then move forward with confidence, so that when their faith is shaken, when tragedy happens, when somebody says, no, that's not true because fossils, you know what I mean? Like, when those hard questions hit, they can fall back on what they've learned before. And I think, having a 12th grader lead a small group is one of those great examples of, like, they probably got asked some surface level questions by those younger kids that they didn't know the answer to. But it's one of those times when they can go, I don't know, let's figure this out together. And then that's the real win in all of it isn't teaching them a bunch of answers to a bunch of questions. It's teaching them how to use the tools that they have to find those answers to those difficult questions, which sets them up for success going forward. We've got I have a student intern right now. She's a college freshman who I sat down with her at the beginning of her senior year. And I said, will it be better for you to lead a small group of 6th grade girls, or to continue on your way and join the 12th grade small group and go to that? And she said, I think I'm ready to, like, lead a group. And I watched that student go from pretty invested to 100% in, to the point where she's still leading the small group. She's my daughter's small group leader. And so I can say, like, I trust this person implicitly pretty much. But, and those are the kind of things that we want to see, like seeing those students that are like, I can't leave this because it's made such an impact in my life that I have to keep pouring into it and keep investing in the next generation and doing the same thing.
Yeah. And that's, I think the main thing, or the thing that I latched on that you talked about was, that is what's going to help. I mean, that's what we need to send our students away. We've all read Cara Powell's, and we all read Almost Christian and all those kind of statistics about, even like the most dedicated students still will walk away from the church. But this is one way to help keep them invested. I always told my small group, or my church, that my goal was for them to be able to go to college and lead a Bible study or lead a small group wherever they go. They have those skills when they graduate to be able to do that. Kind of diving in a little bit into a little bit more meat of how to do this. Once we've determined why, you have some tips and some ideas about how to do this. So I'm gonna let you kind of go through all that, and then I'll probably throw some questions and some curveballs after that. So why don't you tell us, how do we do this?
Yeah, sounds great. I think the first thing that strikes me in that whole scenario is step one, and this is going to seem really simple, I hope, or really surface level, but stop saying mean things about your students. You know what I mean? Like, there's a lot of, and I'm not just assuming that everybody does this, but I'm in all the Facebook youth ministry forums with youth pastors and stuff like that. And the number of times where a youth pastor, even jokingly, will say, like, oh, our students can't handle whatever, or like, how do you protect your youth room from getting destroyed because students only come to break things? Like, all these things. Like, I think a lot of times there's a lot of stereotypes and perceptions about youth ministry and youth pastors and all those things. And on my team, we try really hard to break those perceptions from a staff level. We have a lot of fun together. We do a lot of the stereotypical things, like, it's not uncommon for a Nerf war to break out in the hallway of the offices on a regular basis. Our senior pastor may or may not have gotten shot in between by one of our youth staff with the Nerf round. Like, I get it. We want to have fun. But on the other side of that is that we try to keep it very professional. Like, as far as parents go, we try to be very professional. We try to make sure that they know that their students are in good hands. And at the same time, when our students come into the room, there's an expectation that we place on them for how we carry ourselves here. And do we welcome the outsider that draws inappropriate pictures on the chalkboard in the kids' room? Absolutely. I'm so glad that student is here. But I know that student's not going to stay there if they find a relationship with Jesus. And I think a lot of times what I see on social media sometimes is this feeling that our students can't possibly do anything that matters. and there's like some insults, and not everybody does this. I've been a little bit more like aware of it lately. As I read through those forums, I'm like, man, would you say that like to your students? And some of those people were probably like, yeah, I would. And I'm like, well, don't, like stop. I think there's something to be said for our level of expectation. What we expect we're going to get, and what's celebrated is repeated, and what we talk about is repeated. And so if we're constantly telling our students that they're a distraction, or that they are disrespectful, or that they're rude, or that they're lazy, all these stereotypes that we throw at the next generation, if that's what they're hearing, that's how they're going to live it. That's what they're going to live it out. That's just how they're going to be. And so I think easy first step is like, hey, stop doing that. Like, let's start telling our students that they are capable of more. Let's start telling them that they are equipped to do amazing things, and that they don't have to wait until they reach some perfect age or some like specific life stage to do it. I think that the expectations that we set for our students, they're going to live up. They're either going to rise to them, or they're going to step down to them wherever we decide to set that bar. So set the bar high, like set the expectations high, and communicate those expectations, and then follow through. Like, that's the next thing I'd say is give them ownership, and give them ownership over things that matter. Like, don't just give them ownership of like, oh, well, you can go get the sodas and put them in the fridge for me, and that's leadership. You know what I mean? Like, find the students that are mature and let them lead a small group, and find the students that aren't mature enough to lead a small group and stick them with a leader that's incredible, and let them help lead the conversation and learn and grow. We have to give our students ownership over things that actually matter, so that they can see a level of trust. We have one student that when she's on the worship team, she is the worship leader. Like, if I'm up there with her or Melissa's up there with her, we take direction from her, not the other way around. And at the end of the day, like, is she going to nail it every time? No. But that's what we're there for, to help guide and help direct and help lead her forward. So yeah, giving them ownership over things that matter. And then here's a thing that's a challenge, I think, especially for me. I don't know if you are like this. I'm a bit of a control freak at times, and I want things done a certain way. It's a constant piece of feedback that I get on my reviews, like, let the team step outside, like let them make decisions. And I'm like, I don't want to, but we have to allow them to make some decisions. And sometimes they're going to make decisions that we don't agree with, and we have to let them work it out. We do a senior night at the end of the year. And for this year, I had like this vision of what I wanted that to look like. But I grabbed one of our seniors and I said, I want you to plan this night and run with it. Here are some ideas that I have. She didn't do any of my ideas. Completely different. And it took every ounce of willpower within me to let her do it that way. And it turned out great. It was awesome. There were some things that even in hindsight, I would have done different, but that was a great opportunity for us to follow up, celebrate the wins, and coach to the opportunities. There was never a, well, I told you so. I didn't do that as much as I wanted to. But for me, it's just like, let them make decisions. Even if you don't agree, try it sometimes. Now, that's not to say like if they're making an obviously bad decisions, that's going to get somebody hurt, like, yes, step in. But if it's the things that don't really matter, like, should we have Coke products or Pepsi products? Obviously Coke, but if they choose Pepsi, like, let's just go with it for the weekend. You know what I mean? We have to allow them to make those decisions, and we have to allow them to learn as they do it. And truly, I think if we do that, if we speak life, if we give them ownership, and if we allow them to learn from the mistakes that they make in an environment here, and then follow up, celebrate the wins, coach the opportunities, we're going to see our students' leadership grow in incredible ways, in huge margins, just because we were able to step aside and let it happen. And there's a side bonus of this. Like, a couple weeks ago, I wasn't able to make it on a Wednesday night, and I left my team. A little bit of backstory here. We just had some staff members transition to different roles in the church, and then we brought on a new high school guy. So our middle school, and we brought on we had a student resident who stepped into a full-time position. So basically the whole team shifted a little bit a couple of months ago. And 2 weeks later, I was going on vacation. So I left like all the directions that I could, but it was ultimately up to them to pull off this Wednesday night program while I was gone. This student stepped in and like helped them figure it out, because they were like, we don't know where these signs go. And she's like, oh, I know. And she led them. I get back and they're like, oh man, she saved the day. Like, she rescued us. Why? Because I've let her do it so many times that now she knows, like, she can step in and lead a team of pastors to pull off an event. And, that student's going to be all in for a long time.
I have a student who kind of stepped in. We were rebuilding our youth program. When I took it over, it was a small program. We were rebuilding it, and I told my seniors who were around, I said, y'all can go with everybody else wherever y'all have gone, not show up, or you can come here. But if you come here, I'm gonna rely on you to lead, because I didn't have any adults, I didn't have anything, and so they turned that. But I have one of the students who's came in as a sophomore and was with me for 3 years, ended up being a youth assistant for me. Now it leads her own youth group in college and in kids ministry. But there was a lot of times where she called me. I remember one time she messaged me. She said, "Hey, do you have a itinerary for the trip?" I said, "Not yet." She goes, "Here you go," and it was all done. I mean, all the dates, the times where we're going to stop, the distance between the rest stops. She'd research the rest stops, research the restaurants.
Oh wow!
All that, and so we showed up, and I was like, "Here's the card to go pay the hotel. Here, go." And so, but that one for me, that organization's not my strength. It is hers. But giving those opportunities there, like you said, if you wait until someone's 18 and go, "Okay, now you've watched me do this all the time. Now you can do it." That's not gonna. You need to be able to step in whenever they are doing that. If I'm listening to this and I'm having a hard time turning things over, what are the things that matter? So, like when you said give them ownership over things that matter.
Yeah.
I mean, can you just give a few examples or maybe criteria of what you say? Hey, I'm going to hold on to this as a leader or as a staff team, but these are things I can definitely let go of.
Yeah. So I think from my perspective, one of the things that I hold on to is kind of like the broad overview of like, what are we teaching? I put together the preaching calendar, stuff like that. I couldn't tell you the last time I chose a worship song. You know what I mean? If I'm leading, I get asked like, is there anything you want to do? But I haven't stepped in and said, we're doing these 3 songs on Wednesday, and then these the next. I haven't done that in a while, but I do. And I lead worship as well. Like, I'm super passionate about it. I love it. And it's hard for me to say that I haven't chosen a worship song in a couple of months. It's hard for me to not go to the soundboard and push some faders. If someone chooses a background and the lights don't really match it, it's hard for me to not go back there and be like, can you please just change? Do you not see this? You know what I mean? And so those things I think do matter. Like, and again, with small groups, with who's greeting at the front door, like when students walk in, who's running your check-in situation, things like that. Those are all things that very much matter. Like, if we don't have a good check-in process, how are we possibly going to care for students beyond Wednesday night? That really matters. But it's also something that you can teach a student how to do and let them run with it and be like, hey, make this your own. We also have like a snack bar and little like merch area. And, I have some students that kind of run that everywhere. And that matters because I'm letting them handle cash and, things of that nature. It's not always the big things. It doesn't have to be these huge, like, let them preach. Like I've met one 6th grader ever that I thought, I'd let her preach every now and again. You know what I mean? But so I'm not saying that. I'm not saying like walk away and just turn over the keys to the, to the students. But at the same time, like, anything that is within your program that you can hand off, like, go for it. I have students preach from time to time. I have volunteers preach from time to time. The bulk of that communication comes from staff because we need to be the ones that are driving the vision and the ministry forward. But when you platform somebody, like, man, all of a sudden it makes them go like, oh yeah, you see me, you recognize my strengths. You've given me an opportunity to work within what I love to do. And maybe you've even challenged me along the way. Like I asked the girl one of the girls that's going to preach on senior night this year. I already asked her in like September because I know that it's not what she wants to do. And so I'm like, hey, I think that you should do this because I think you have a lot to offer. I think that you have a really good perspective on what student ministry looks like. So she's got from September to May to think about it. You know what I mean? But yeah, it's just more of a like challenge them along the way, give them stuff that maybe wouldn't be in their passion or in their gift set if they were asked, but give them opportunities to explore those things as well. You never know what you're going to find.
And you're helping them to discover what they are good at. And I love it because it's kind of a sandbox. They can try worship leading or they can try this, but then they can really find something. We had some students who they ended up teaching with elementary school in the Sunday school stuff. And they've continued to do that. And they've gone to their next church where they went to college and they volunteered and got involved with those things. And so I think that's huge to do that.
That's awesome. My daughter and two of her best friends, they're all in 6th grade. So they just moved from Kidman into our ministry this past year. And every Sunday morning they go to middle school service for the first service. And then they go and they serve in the kids ministry in like the pre-K rooms, just playing with kids, and they love it. And I mean, they're making a huge impact. Like they are the people, right? Like there's an adult in the room, but they're the ones that are doing it. Mm-hmm. And it's a huge thing for them. My daughter will not miss a Sunday morning because like she feels like she's contributing and she's serving, and man, she just loves what she does. It's because she loves that people trust her to do things that matter. Like one of the things about church, like if you don't have a kids ministry that parents are willing to drop their kids off in, you don't really have a church. You know what I mean? They're not going to come back. And so knowing that these little ones are being entrusted to 6th graders and their parents are comfortable with that because they see how much they love and care for it and support them, like that's a huge win.
Yeah, that does bring up a question though, and maybe you may have built a culture there at your church where this isn't a problem, but I can see some churches where you say, hey, we're going to let the kids run this stuff, we're going to let the youth run these things, and maybe not in the youth ministry, but in the church, there's some pushback. Right. Have you experienced some pushback, or how would you help someone deal with pushback like that?
Yeah, there's some areas where it was a little slower. We've got students now that run cameras at our broadcast location. So what goes on the internet is seen first through the eyes of a 7th grader. You know what I mean? And that's a big deal. Like we've got some students that run like on-screen graphics on Sunday morning and things like that. And some of those were a little slower to take because, everybody's thing's the most important thing. And that's why we're here. It should be like, you should feel that your area of ministry is the most important, right? And so we don't want them to quote unquote mess anything up, right? And so that could be some of the pushback is like, hey, we're concerned that they may not be ready for something like this, or we're concerned that they will get a text message or a TikTok video in the middle of service, and then all of a sudden they'll forget to change the graphics because they'll be distracted. I think those things are legitimate causes for concern in areas like that. And so then if they're not ready for it now, how can you help me get them ready? So like if I have a student that's obviously interested in running a camera, how do we prep them? How do we make it something that they can do? If it's something like on-screen graphics, there's so many entry-level positions into that world that can get you ready for a Sunday morning. You've got kids ministry that runs worship videos. So you're literally clicking one thing every 4 or 5 minutes. And so that is an easier intro than, hey, you're running graphics for this very fast song that you have to press the button every 10 seconds and the sequence may be off. You know what I mean? So I would say if you have a student that's interested in production's an easier example here, that's interested in production per se, and your production person is a little hesitant, find some ways to help them get into conversation and find some entry-level spots that they can serve in. Or even if it's like the camera example, I think we have cameras in our worship center that don't really get used. And so just put them on a dummy camera and let them play with it and see how it goes. And not every church may have that, and I get that. But I think every church can find ways to help a student move towards what they want to do and where they want to serve. And same if it's in kids ministry and it's a 6th grader and your kids pastor is uncomfortable with that, you don't have to put a 6th grader in charge of a small group alone. You can put them with a co-leader for a while. You can even, there's role play it, like sit them down and have them ask you the small group questions and lead you through the small group material and help them learn how to do it. I'm all for making sure they're prepared, because the last thing we want to do is stick a student in a spot where they're going to fail, because then they're going to be discouraged and they're not going to want to do it again. And so instead of like pushing students away, let's kind of like lead them forward and lead them to the place where they want to go.
I thought one of the interesting things you said that I agree with is those entry level positions. And I kind of almost imagined, like, I don't know if you have this, but I could imagine somebody writing out, hey, if this is the goal, what are the steps to get to there? So that way somebody can come in and know, hey, you're going to be creating slides at home, and then you're going to be running a dummy camera, and then you're going to be doing, or you're helping lead games, and then it's the whole watch. I do, you watch, we do, and then you do, and I watch.
Leadership.
Something along those lines. And so just creating those entry level or those ways, and everybody knows those, and that works for if you're looking for volunteers, hesitant volunteers. I ended up getting my adult volunteers. I kind of got them because I told them, I said, hey, I need you to just be a presence in the room. My students have the small group questions. They've got that they've got that down. So me having student leaders helped me to even get adults, because then the adults came in and then they were like, hey, I can do this. And so it was almost kind of reverse thing of that.
Absolutely. I think that works really well. Like even, we have one small group leader who adamantly did not want to be a small group leader. And she ended up coming out and helping for one of our events with just serving food. And then she ended up helping lead. So what would happen is they would serve food, and then they would go to our service that night, and then they'd come back and serve food again. But in between, we'd have small group time. So after that service, I walked into the kitchen where they were going to get ready to be serving food, and she was leading a group of adults through those same kind of discussion questions. And I was like, what are you guys doing? She's like, oh, well, we just figured we would do a small group too while we were at it. I'm like, tell me again why you don't want to be a small group leader? Like, you're doing it right now. And now she is. Like, she leads for our 8th grade girls, and she's been doing it since they're in 6th grade.
Yeah. And that's part of the, setting an example for the adults, and student leadership. A lot of times does that. If the students can do this, then you can do it as well. So now another thing you mentioned is allowing them to make decisions and being okay with the ones you don't agree with. Are there some tips or some things that you have learned, whether it's breathing techniques or meditation or some other ways that you can kind of let go? Because I know some people are perfectionists. Some people like it particular ways. So what are some things that you have helped people to, or that has helped you in that situation?
Yeah, I think that it starts from, step back from before you give them the opportunity, right? Like, let's say we're going to have a student plan a service. Identify before you have that conversation, what are the things that are essential, if you will? Like, what are the things where it has to be a certain way? And as far as a service goes, I would probably argue that list should be very, very short. Even if it's like, we're going to have a sermon, we're going to have worship. And I think our list of essentials for our Wednesday night things, we kind of focus on 4 things: worship, gospel, small groups, fun. And we believe that each one of those things should be represented every Wednesday night. And so that's kind of the list of essentials for me. And for a special, like, one-off event, I can be talked out of one of them. You know what I mean? Like, oh, we're not going to do a sermon tonight because we're going to do some other thing in place of it. So in a special event, I can probably be talked out of one. Like, if we're going to do a big flag football tournament, but we want to have a sermon, we may cut worship for the night so that we can have more fun. But that's going to be a rare circumstance. But yeah, identify the things that are essential for you, and have that conversation up front. Just like, hey, I want you to do this. Here are the things that we need to make sure happen. And then outside of that, and those non-essential, the rest of it, like the fluff, if you will, or the whatever you want to call it, icing, if that's the cake, give them the freedom, you know what I mean? And obviously you're going to step in if there's something that, hey, I want to show this video as part of this service, and you find out it's not exactly appropriate. Like, you're going to want to step in for things like that. You don't want the phone call from the parents, because if you get the phone call from the parents, you have to own it. You can't be like, oh, I delegated that to a student and that's what they came up with. That's on you, man. You know what I mean? So yeah, I would say hang on to the essentials, then just make sure everything is like quote unquote appropriate for your context. And outside of that, probably just got to learn to let go and know that like it's hard. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it's tough. It really is. Like this, we do 3 worship songs every Wednesday night. And at the senior night, she wanted to do 6. And I'm like, that's going to be a lot for a middle school boy. They're going to check out. But all right, we're going to try it. And she ended up doing 4, which I was like, okay. The good thing is if you let them walk through the process, they might figure out along the way some of the things that are screaming in the back of your head, you know?
Yeah.
And so it worked out. It was, as far as like being just okay with it, I don't have the answer to that. If you figure it out, let me know. Cause sometimes it's tough, you know, you're like, why would you do that? But okay, here we go.
Well, at the end, we'll ask you for your contact information and maybe they can call you and tell you how they figured out how to do it. But
there you go. I love it.
It is hard. Like it is hard. I know from doing that to know that you're something you mentioned, like you're responsible for it, even though you're not in charge of it. We had small groups going off to do dinner one time, and I realized that I have kids in small groups all over the city. But I'm not there. I'm not in charge of any of them. But if when all else fails and when it all boils down to, I'm responsible. And so that is a hard thing and it's hard to move from that role. And I think a lot of times groups that are moving, because we have groups of all sizes listening to the podcast. When groups move from kind of that one youth leader, a few volunteer model, and they have to move, and youth leaders have to move to that I'm leading leaders. I'm not leading students anymore. That's that hard transition to make. So we talked about why to do it. We talked about how to do it. So if you've made it to this point, you're listening and wondering, so what are the results? Like what are the wins? What keeps you doing this and keeps you in student leadership? Because it would be easy, right? Is it probably easier to do it on your own?
Absolutely, especially if you've got, like, for me, I have 2 other staff members, and then our we have our main, like, one of our main worship leaders is with us on Wednesday nights as well. So we can do it, you know, without much help. Like, so yeah, so it is. And then there's less like trying to figure out who's going to actually be there and who's not and all that good stuff. So,
because I think that's what
it's a bit easier.
That's one of the myths or the things, like, well, you're turning all the work over the students. Why do we even hire you if the students can do it? But can you tell us why that's not true? And then we'll talk about what the results are.
Yeah. Well, I think anybody who's ever been asked that question is probably able to answer it pretty quickly. You know what I mean? Because you're doing it, you know? And so honestly, is it easier to do it all alone? Sure. But at the end of the day, what have you actually done? You know, like, sure, you've turned on a projector and you've played some worship songs, but does anybody find Jesus? Did anybody move forward in their relationship with him? And did anybody get equipped to help others do the same thing? And so, at the end of the day, sometimes it does look like I don't really have a job. I was joking today with some mutual, like, ministry friends, and we restructured our staff to where we have a middle school guy and a high school guy. So I introduced the 2 of them, and then I was like, and I am here and I don't really know what my job is anymore, you know? And so they thought that was pretty funny. And we get the stuff like that all the time. You know, you're a lead pastor. You probably get the you only work one day a week kind of situation, because you preach on Sunday and then you sit, right? Like, you don't do anything else throughout the week. And so for us, like, we work twice as much because we have Sundays and Wednesdays. So, but other than that, we don't do anything but sit home and play video games. So as we delegate these things, like, we get super excited about it, like kids serving and things like that. But I think that at the end of the day, as you push forward and you do that, you might get those questions up front. Like, if you're delegating everything, so what? But then when it starts to affect the other members of your team, the other members of your church, when your kids pastor is talking about how excited they are because there are students serving in their ministries and helping them take care of their stuff and helping them do that. And when they're, like, students on the worship team, like on Sunday mornings in front of adults, like leading them in worship, and it starts to affect everyone around you, then they're like, oh, I see it. I get it now. I understand why this is important. And it's great too on the other side, because now all of a sudden, as your students are serving with other pastors and ministry leaders, like, there's another voice pouring into them, pointing them to Jesus and pointing them to, you know, being better versions of themselves and being, you know, disciplers, if you will. Like, I think that's the point where it kind of switches and people are like, oh, I see what you do now. Like, I see how important it is to lean into that ministry model.
Yeah. So what are the results? What is it that you talked a little bit about it throughout this, but if you can kind of pull them together, what are the end results? Why should I stick through and do this? What's going to be the benefits for my team, for myself, for the students, for the church?
Yeah. I think, well, first of all, I know we see less students wander away at the end of it all. Like, there's a massive fall off between high school and college. And we talked about this a little bit at the beginning, where a student gets outside of their home, like they've grown up in, especially if you get a student that grows up with a Christian home and has good, solid youth pastors and good, solid other ministry staff pouring into them along the way. There's still this fall off afterwards when they go off to college, and all of a sudden they're responsible for that on their own. When we get students involved in owning that portion of leadership, they kind of see what's real, and they learn, like, this matters, this is important, and less of them fall away. Like, that's not me making stuff up. It's not anecdotal. There are actual stats that you can find that say, like, when students have an extra voice pouring into their life, they're less likely to fall away from the church. When they serve, they're less likely to fall away from the church. So less of them walk away. And I think that's a huge win. It's what we want, right? It's the goal that a student would own their faith and carry it out through the rest of their life. And especially for a student that leaves home to go to school somewhere else, if a student, Nebraska goes to school, a lot of them go to Southwest Missouri State or something. I can't even remember the whole name of the school because it's so long, but oddly, a lot of them go there. If they move away from home, like, all of a sudden they're alone. They're trying to figure out who they are now on their own and what do they have to fall back on. And if church is something like, well, I used to serve in the kids ministry at a church. Maybe I'll go check out this church and see what their kids ministry is like. And if I like it, if that can be their first fallback, that's a huge win. It helps keep them engaged in the gospel and helps keep them moving forward. Selfishly, on the other side of it, like, when you have students leading within your ministry will grow. Like, it just will. Why? Because students love inviting people to things that they're doing. Like, come watch me do this thing that I do. And it doesn't really matter what it is. Students are going to tell their friends. I have one student, she's in 8th grade this year, and she leads worship on our adult worship team on Sunday mornings. And she has never come to a rehearsal or a Sunday morning without a friend, whether it's the same friend as last week or a different one. She always brings a posse because she wants them to see what she's doing. And so our ministries grow and they start to thrive, and then those friends get interested in the same thing, and it kind of creates this spiral effect of healthy growth, not just numerical growth. Like, we can buy students' attention, right? Like with pizza and video games and all that stuff. But this is them getting involved in a way that's going to be a healthy multiplication, as opposed to just butts and seats, if you will. At the same time, we're teaching them skills, and they're learning to point other people towards Jesus. And so when they get an opportunity to have that conversation with somebody, why do you believe what you believe? They're equipped to have it. And again, now we see not just personal growth and ownership, not just ministry growth and ownership, but kingdom growth, because a student owned their faith. And then the last thing I'd add to that is that they learn to process information and make decisions. So if you let them make decisions and then coach them through it, they're not just learning to spit out a response that you've programmed into them. They're actually learning critical thinking, how to process thought, and how to get to the right solution, as opposed to us just being like, memorize this set of 10 rules and you'll be fine. They've learned how to apply those to every circumstance, and now they're just solid,
And when you say every circumstance, that's also, in my opinion, that's in the church, and that's also outside of the church. They
absolutely
learning those to process information and make decisions. That's going to be something that's going to benefit them, no matter what they're doing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, it's been great talking with you, and we have just a few more minutes before we wrap up. If someone is listening to this, or if someone's listening to this, still hesitant, still wondering, could you just talk to the youth leader and say, hey, this is why, and I know we've gone through the whole list here, but what's the elevator pitch? What's the real quick, hey, this is why you or why your church you may be talking to a senior pastor or someone who their youth leaders trying to go say, we need to do this, but they're like, no, the adults do the things, we do the stuff. So you can speak to any of those audiences that you want, but what would you say to someone where there's some hesitation about this whole process?
Yeah, I might, because of the way it was worded a little bit, I like this idea of just stepping back and talking to the church at large, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think one of the things that I hear from even senior pastors a lot is like, we want more young people in the church. We want more young people in the church. We want to make sure that our church isn't growing old and dying out, right? Like, I'm in a church that's 50 years old. So I get that. Like, and my campus is the original building of the church, and we have an older crowd. We want more young people. You are who you platform. Like, you are who you platform. If you want more diversity in your church, platform more diversity in your church. If you want more youth presence in your church, platform more youth in your church. And I think sometimes we think that just means we have to just go find somebody from that demographic and throw them up on stage and pray that they don't swear. You know what I mean? But for us, really what that means is pour into their life in such a way that you would trust them with that platform. Like, we've been given a huge, God has entrusted us with so much, like a huge mission. That's our whole ministry models. We tell every student, like, you matter to God, you matter to us, and you matter to his mission. And that mission is to point other people towards him so that heaven can be fuller and hell can be more empty. And so we've been entrusted to do that. And how do we do that? But man, we got to develop this, like, disciples who develop disciples. And that's the whole answer, right? Like, man, if you want kingdom growth within your church, start there. Like, that's what we look at Jesus's disciples, and most of them were teenagers or early 20s and younger people, right? Like, start there. Like, let's really pour into that next generation. And we know that if we do that, then we can expect so much kingdom expansion going forward, because let's just face it, they got more energy than us old guys, and like, they can, they have more influence now than ever before and more access to people than ever before. And if we can point that towards the gospel, then it will continue to grow, and we'll continue to see kingdom advancement. And I think that every time we see like this huge revival or massive group of people turning to Jesus, a lot of times it originates with younger folks, like younger people who have just decided that it's time to do something different. And so we need to be teaching our students that it's time to do something different. And it's time to point all of our energy and all of our giftings towards helping other people know who Jesus is and follow him.
Well, Brandon, I have probably 1,000 more questions, and you probably have 1,000 more answers, and we could go on, but I want to end right there because I think that's a great place to end. And we've already talked about some other things that we may have you on to talk about later. But awesome. I've thoroughly enjoyed talking with you. And if someone wants to contact you, to get a hold of you, what are the ways? Where are you on socials or email or whatever? How can we get a hold of you?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter as Brandon Hair, Hair. So any of those work, or you can shoot me an email. It's just brandon.hair@calvary.ch.
Well, awesome. I tried to get Russell Martin, but there's a baseball player ahead of me that took all of my took all of my stuff. But
no good. Just put a bunch of extra L's in there, like L. Campbell does.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, and we will talk to you later. And thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Hey, thanks everyone for joining us today. We hope you were encouraged and inspired by this week's episode, and that you found tools that you can use as you pour into the lives of your students.
Yes, and as always, if you enjoyed this episode, if you found it helpful and insightful, we would ask that you leave a comment and a rating on whatever platform you're listening on. Also, maybe you know someone who would benefit from this conversation. Take a moment, tag us on social media at Talk Student Men, tag them and let them know about it. So Brent, next week we have a brand new conversation. And so why don't you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, so next week I sit down with Cameron Bresson, and Cameron's a friend of mine from 6 or 7 years back. We served in different churches in the same town, Fairfield, Texas. And he joins us next week to sit down and have the conversation of how to create culture within your student ministry. It's a fantastic conversation, and I can't wait for next week so you guys can hear it.
Well, I'm looking forward to that. And I hope if you're listening to this, that you are looking forward to that as well. Hey, just a reminder, every Thursday morning, another episode drops. And so mark your calendars, subscribe to the podcast, check us out on YouTube, all those ways that you can make sure that you don't miss the next exciting episode. Also, go to our website, studentministryconversations.org. There's show notes and links from this episode. Just search for this week's episode number in the search bar. And there's also other articles and helpful posts as well. Well, that about wraps it up for this week. So we are praying for you as you continue to lead your students in ministry, and we're looking forward to talking to you next week. See you then. Hey, well, Brent, that was great. And Jerry, thank you for joining us. And thank you for listening, for giving your time to listen to this podcast. And we hope that maybe you were encouraged and inspired by this week's episode, and that you found some tool or something that you can use as you continue to pour into the lives of your students.
Yeah, if you enjoyed this episode and found it helpful, we would ask that you leave a comment and a rating on whatever platform you're listening to us on. We would appreciate that so much. Also, maybe you know someone who would benefit from this conversation. Take a moment, share this with them on social media, tag them and tag us at Talk Student Men on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Also, we have some new things to mention, that now we have a merchandise store where you can support the podcast and get some t-shirts. You can check that out at studentministryconversations.org under the shop tab. And then also you can support our podcast because we are listener supported. We have great ambitions for this podcast, to make it better audio quality, to have transcripts available for each episode on our website that you can look and read through, and all of that costs money, and we would love to get that out there for you. So if you enjoy this podcast and you would not mind giving financially to support us, we would appreciate it. You can also find a link to that on our website as well.
Yeah, definitely. Hey, listen, we have some great episodes coming up and some great interviews scheduled. And several of y'all have already reached out and said you wanted to be on a podcast, and you have made suggestions. And so we are putting those together and making those recordings. And we are looking forward so much to the conversations we have in the coming weeks. And we also want to remind you, go back and look at all the other podcasts. We were talking today, we have 26 episodes up. We've done this for half of a year. And so we hope that you will go back and re-listen to previous ones. Go back and find your favorites. Let us know what your favorites are as you continue to listen to the Student Ministry Conversations podcast.
Just a reminder, be sure to go to studentministryconversations.org for show notes and links from this episode. Just search for this week's episode number in the search bar. We also have other helpful articles and posts as well. Again, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next week.